With Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny HD being released last year, Capcom put out a survey some time ago regarding the game and the series, asking if fans would be interested in seeing any other game within the franchise being remastered. And while I do think that Onimusha 3 Demon Siege is likely going to be remastered in the foreseeable future, with the added possibility of seeing a remaster of Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, as of making this video, Capcom has simply stated that they're aware of the demand for a remaster of Onimusha 3, but that the development team is all hands on deck for Way of the Sword. However, with that in mind, I did want to take the time to talk about some potential quality of life improvements and features that they could implement into both of those games in particular. So without any further delays, let's get right into it. Now, I won't lie, I was struggling to come up with potential improvements and features for Onimusha 3 outside of what we can expect from a remaster, such as weapon switching, easy mode available from the start, all mini-games available from the start, the option to switch from tank controls to a modern control scheme, as well as additional save slots with an autosave feature. And that's because even without 90% of these, or even if some of these features don't return from the previous entries, Onimusha 3 is an all-around solid game that already addressed the core gameplay issues that 2 had. So even though these will likely be in an Onimusha 3 remaster, there's very little, if anything at all, to really improve in the game. Now, like I said, I did struggle to come up with what they could potentially do with the remaster of 3, but I think there's a few ideas that would be nice to see. I think the first thing would be to give Samanosuke the ability to weapon charge Raisen, Enryu, Shippu, and the Bishaman Sword. While it wasn't possible to charge these weapons in the original Onimusha 3, you could do so in Genma Onimusha, at least with Raisen, Enryu, and Shippu. Now, if it wasn't possible to carry over the attack animations from Genma Onimusha, they could hypothetically carry over the attack animations featured in Onimusha 2 from Buraito, Senpumaru, and the Rekka Ken, since those are essentially the equivalent of the weapons that Samanosuke uses. This would make these weapons far more viable in the remaster than they were in the original release, especially for the training mode, since some of those training tutorials require weapons that are capable of being charged. And since we're on the subject of weapons, the ability to switch weapons on the fly has been in the series since the remaster of Warlords, but it's not exactly perfect in either Onimusha 1 or 2. The reason I feel this could be improved is because in both of the remasters we currently have, you're required to stand still when switching between weapons with no ability to switch to the ultimate weapon in Onimusha 2, not to mention that the secondary characters aren't able to switch weapons either. Part of the reason that I'm bringing this up is because in the case of 3, Samanosuke has 7 total weapons that can be used throughout the game, which they'll likely limit him to only be able to switch between the main 3 weapons of the game, those being Tenso, Kuga, and Shigo, which would feel pretty limiting in my opinion. Keep in mind that even though you can equip the Rekka Ken in Onimusha 2, once you switch to any of the available weapons to use in that game, you do have to go back into the menu to switch back to the Rekka Ken. So this is something that I'd like to see them address in Onimusha 3 with the Bishaman Sword and Bishaman Whip, since they did take a step backwards in that regard with Onimusha 2. I think the improvement needed on the system is to let players switch between all of the available weapons with the exception of the Standard Sword and Oni Whip respectively. To add to this point, the remasters for both Onimusha 1 and 2 also gave you the option to switch between multiple projectile-based weapons. However, in Onimusha 3, they dropped having multiple projectile-based weapons for the main characters in favor of having Samanosuke primarily having a bow with various arrow types. Jacques did have a handgun, but it was only used to finish off to down Genma. And of course, Michelle has a variety of firearms to use as her main form of attack, so there's a few ways that they can do this. They can keep the weapon switching based on how it's done in Onimusha 2, where you would hold down L2 or the left trigger button, then press right on the D-pad to switch between the different Oni weapons, and then by pressing left to switch between the different arrow types, at least in this case in Onimusha 3 for Samanosuke. However, I don't think that would work well considering that the other 2 characters don't have the same weapon variety that Samanosuke has, and the developers would likely want to make the controls that are a part of this quality of life feature feel universal. So I think instead what they would do is slightly revise the way that it works to address Samanosuke specifically. I could see Capcom making the weapon switching work like this. While holding L2 or the left trigger button, whichever direction you press on the D-pad, that will switch to the corresponding weapon assigned to that direction. For example, when playing as Samanosuke, pressing left on the D-pad could switch to Tenso, while pressing right could switch to Kuga, and then by pressing up, you will switch to Chigo. Maybe they could give players the ability to assign each weapon to their preferred direction for more player choice. This is where it can get a little tricky, however, because one of 2 things can be done from here. Assuming Capcom wants to maintain the ability to switch between projectile-based weapons, or at least in this case arrow types, they can make it so that down on the D-pad is used for that specific action. Alternatively though, they could leave that button available for the standard sword, which at that point you could easily apply the same logic to both Jacques and Michel with their respective weapons. Additionally, if they were to do it that way, they could make it so that double tapping in each direction for Samanosuke could allow you to switch between Ryzen, Shippu, and Ryu and the Bishaman sword seamlessly, leaving only the arrow types to be switched within the menu. Another possible solution to this problem would be to have the ability to cycle back and forth through all of the weapons by tapping left or right, up to switch between Akko's vest on the fly, and then down to switch between Samanosuke's arrow types. But I say this is another possible solution because this method only really addresses Samanosuke, while the method I suggested earlier would address all three characters. On that note, Michelle should have the ability to switch between all of her firearms in my opinion, because unlike the supporting characters from previous entries, all of her weapons are viable and are situational, which wasn't really the case in the last two games. And this would be a major improvement on that end, because at least with those previous two remasters, it does feel like the secondary characters were more of an afterthought, which makes sense considering how often you get to play as them. Now, weapon switching aside, what else could they possibly add as a quality of life feature to Onimusha 3? Well, I think they could slightly rework the ultimate mode. Really, in this instance, it's the smallest change, but I think it would make the most sense for Akko's black vest to be automatically unlocked and usable, since we already are given the Bishaman sword and Bishaman whip from the start of the game, plus all of the weapons acquired are fully leveled up with unlimited magic, on top of having fully leveled up armor, infinite arrows, infinite grenades, several healing items, and talismans. This would be really a small and insignificant change that wouldn't be so drastic or impossible for Capcom to implement in my opinion. Besides, its ultimate mode, I don't think it makes that big of a difference if we have Akko's black vest from the start of the game for easy ESINs when we have all of those other items available to us with that specific game mode in mind. I think what they could do in terms of quality of life is slightly rework the puzzles, rather one specific puzzle that drives me absolutely insane whenever I play Onimusha 3, and that's the Mont Saint Michel gas puzzle, because you literally have to do a button pressing sequence that is very easy to get mixed up, and taking too long will cause you to start from the very beginning. So I think if they change the button prompts to not be fairly similar, especially towards the end of the puzzle, and drop the ones that repeat, or at the very least not make you redo the entire puzzle if you take too long, that would certainly make things a little more tolerable. Maybe they can make it so that the speed of your inputs doesn't impact you solving it, because if I'm not mistaken, if you go too fast, it can make the game think that you've pressed the wrong buttons, forcing you to start over, and that's genuinely why I think it's worse than the water puzzle in Onimusha Warlords, but that's just my personal opinion. Anyway, this next feature I'm not so sure they could implement, since it might break the game in some ways and even conflicts with what happens in the story, and that would be to allow you to switch between Samanosuke and Jacques without the use of the teleporting gateways that allow Akko to travel between time periods. But like I said, I'm not so sure that they could add this feature because it does conflict with the story and might break the game in some ways. For example, if you happen to teleport during combat, which wasn't originally intended. Maybe a more reasonable change to the mechanic would be to allow Akko to carry more items with her, since you can only send a few handful of items at a time. As for new features, the only thing that I can think of for Onimusha 3, which the game originally had to begin with, is a save data transfer feature, although keep in mind that it worked slightly differently depending on if you had the Japanese version or not. How it works is if you had save data of Onimusha Blade Warriors, you could unlock the panda costume from Onimusha Warlords for Samanosuke to use in Onimusha 3, and vice versa, you could unlock an additional character, Garaganto, in Onimusha Blade Warriors. Considering that it's unclear if we'll be seeing a remaster of Onimusha Blade Warriors, I believe that the save data feature would just automatically be unlocked in the remaster for Onimusha 3. The Japanese exclusive save data feature goes a little further though. If you had save data of Onimusha Warlords, it would automatically unlock Ryzen and Ryu and Shippu for you to use from the start of the game, instead of requiring you to unlock them via completion of the Dark Realms and completing the game at least once. This specific save data unlock I think could be made globally this time around, since it doesn't make a lot of sense to make it a regional exclusive. Now what I'd really like to see is some brand new costumes thrown into the mix through this feature. Onimusha 2 HD received a save data transfer bonus from Onimusha Warlords HD, which was a brand new Samanosuke themed costume. While in the case of Onimusha 3, we can only speculate as to what sort of costumes they could bring into the game. I think the most likely would be Samanosuke's classic costume for Samanosuke to use, while Jacques would get Jubei's standard armor as his alternate costume, assuming they take both games into account. However, considering that Onimusha 3 HD will likely be released after Onimusha Way of the Sword, I think it would be a good idea and opportunity for Capcom to include costumes also through save data transfer from Onimusha Way of the Sword. I think a Musashi Miyamoto themed costume for Samanosuke would be perfect, and for Jacques, either an Ono no Takamura or Kojiro Sasaki themed costume would be the most fitting in my opinion, especially since Jacques' gauntlet visually matches Ono's, and he does have an alternate costume in Onimusha 3 that does have some similarities in details to Kojiro's design in Way of the Sword. I think these would be very possible to see given that Onimusha 2 was remastered using the RE engine, so we'll likely be seeing the same thing with both Onimusha 3 and Onimusha Dawn of Dreams when the time comes for both of those games. And that's all I could really think of for Onimusha 3, however Dawn of Dreams on the other hand, I have a lot more to suggest, partly because I am biased against the game. I really dislike Dawn of Dreams both from a narrative and gameplay perspective, but I know that there's a number of you who absolutely love that game the way that it is. So keep in mind that the suggestions that I'm going to be making mostly won't be around the lore that conflicts with the rest of the series, because realistically speaking, Capcom isn't going to touch anything related to the story, even though I wish they would. I will, however, focus on the various things I would like for them to rework to make this game not only function better than the original, but also address the general quality of life gameplay features that I think could benefit this game overall to make the experience far more enjoyable for fans like myself who despise this game. So the very first thing that I'd like for them to address are the airborne enemies. A majority of these enemies are specifically designed around mechanics from Onimusha 3. In Onimusha 3, all it takes is for Samanosuke to use an arrow, or for you to lock on and press X with Jacques in order to hit those enemies while they're in the air. In Dawn of Dreams, however, because they decided that Soki, Tenkai, Jubei, and Roberto didn't need any sort of projectile-based options, you need to hit back then square in order to hit these enemies out of the air. Sounds simple, right? Well, it would be if it actually worked consistently. Now, going through the story, these enemies aren't that bad to deal with. It's actually in the Dark Realm where you start to see these issues come up. For example, what'll happen is if you have one or more Baza hanging out on the ceiling, and then from there you decide that you want to try to knock them out of the air, well, you're just standing there hoping that they'll swoop down to attack to make the process go by faster, but that's only if they feel like cooperating with you. But assuming that they won't, which is highly likely, then you'll have to do that back square input, and this is the part of the combat around these enemies that genuinely pisses me off, because you have to be perfectly lined up in order for the character that you're playing as to actually hit the enemies, otherwise you're just standing there like a maniac missing every single swing. Really, the only character that has the easiest time to deal with them is Ohatsu, because she's the only character in the game that has projectile-based weapons. Now, I highly doubt that Capcom will just randomly add in a bow for all the characters to use, even though that would be one solution to the problem. I think the more realistic solution would be to increase the likelihood of those airborne enemies coming down to attack, and to increase the size of the hitboxes of both the enemy and the back square attacks to make this less of an issue. So that's the first thing that I'd like to see. Next would be the rebalance of the Dark Puppets. Dark Puppets were first introduced in Genma Onimusha, but were also seen in Onimusha 3 prior to their appearance in Dawn of Dreams. Now, in those past games, you could fight them like any other enemy, and they would all die the same. Granted, deflecting their magic attacks would deal massive amounts of damage. However, in Dawn of Dreams, the only way to defeat them is to use Soki's Sword of Purification, also known as Requiem, to kill them. I don't know why they thought at the time it was a good idea to rework these enemies, but I'd simply like to see the Dark Puppets changed back to the way they were in previous entries, while still maintaining that Requiem would be the most effective way to defeat them. The next thing I'd like to see them rework is the animation to get back up when you've been knocked down. In all the games prior, you'd get back up pretty quickly after being knocked down, but in Dawn of Dreams it takes an eternity to get back up unless if you press the X button as you're getting knocked down, in which case the character that you're playing as at any given moment will, along with having a rolling or sliding animation depending on the attack that they were hit by. The timing changes based on the attacks that you're being hit by, but none of that really matters when you get into the areas with lots of enemies or the Dark Realm. So I'd like to see them either increase the overall speed of getting back up, or decrease the amount of time that you're on the ground. This would just make certain parts of the game less annoying to deal with in my opinion, and more specifically, it would make the Dark Realm a little more tolerable. Speaking of the Dark Realm, there's a couple of things that I think Capcom should do to improve the experience. Unfortunately, they took a major step backwards by getting rid of the branching paths that Onimusha 3's Dark Realms introduced, which in my opinion was the biggest mistake they made, because 3's Dark Realm is perfect and it's not helped by the fact that you have to go through 100 floors of increasingly more annoying enemies and a boss fight at the very end. end. Now, I don't think that Capcom would rework the Dark Realm to be like Onimusha 3's iteration. However, what I think they can do is implement a feature that will let you pick from the highest floor that you've reached with any given character that you want to play as, similar to Devil May Cry 5's take on the Bloody Palace mode. I bring this up for a few reasons, first being how much time it takes to complete the Dark Realm in this game. In my most recent playthrough of the game, it took several attempts to complete with Soki, and with the final attempt taking about 8 hours to complete. Keep in mind that's just for one character. I still technically have 400 more floors to go through with 4 other characters. Secondly, it doesn't help that the higher tier health items are very hard to come by, even if you go out of your way to craft some of those items or somehow manage to get a lucky drop from an enemy, at least on your initial run of the game. So being able to stop at any floor and continue from where you left off would significantly cut down on the amount of time and potential attempts it takes to complete it. Additionally, I would like to see the possibility of an online co-op variation of the mode, and I know that's a lot to ask for, but considering the fact that the game can be played in co-op through cheats, I think it would make this game vastly more enjoyable to play through it in co-op. I also think it would be a really nice option to enhance your weapons, armors, and skills within the Dark Realm, and the reason I bring this up is because you do acquire weapons within the Dark Realm, and some of them are the best weapons of the game, but in order to max out their potential, you have to leave the realm, enhance your gear, upgrade your character, and then start from the very beginning. Granted, if they give us the option to start from the highest floor that we left off from, we might not need this feature, but it could save some time from going through loading screens between areas. Another improvement that I would like to see is the ability to go back to all previous areas of the game much sooner. As it currently is, you can only go back to certain parts of the game within certain chapters, with there being a semi-point of no return to those areas, at least until you get to the tail end of the game, at which point you can then revisit all of the previous areas. I'm not exactly sure why they did that, but I think with the future remaster, they should implement the ability to go back to all of the areas from the very beginning, especially since you no longer need to swap discs at that point. This aspect of the game is mainly for you to go back to previously unreachable areas because you didn't have a certain ally available to you, or you missed certain items, or you just wanted to complete some Oni challenges. Before I get into the Oni challenges, I also wanted to quickly mention that I do think that the game could benefit from a chapter select feature, since it does feature 15 chapters, so it would mostly be beneficial to players wanting to jump to certain points of the game sooner without having to start from the very beginning. The Oni challenges are something that I think could use some minor adjustments. Primarily, I think they should add in the option to see the time requirements to see what the average times are for bronze, silver, and gold ranks, along with the recommended characters for said challenges. Lastly, and I know this contradicts what I said earlier about mentioning the lore, but I would like to see some of the weapons and items in the game be renamed and re-described to be accurate to the overall lore. Considering that Capcom technically already did this to some degree in Onimusha 2 HD, I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibilities to see them give certain weapons and items the correct names and descriptions in Dawn of Dreams. Charge attacks for the characters that have them also need to be reworked as well. For those unaware, charge attacks have been in the series since Genma Onimusha, and all of the games that had them prior had two very important aspects to the attack. The two important aspects were a visual and audio indicator to let the players know when the attacks are fully charged. The charge attacks in Dawn of Dreams lack those indicators, so it would be a much needed change to make those attacks a little more viable, because as of current, I personally avoid using them because of how unclear it is when those attacks are fully charged. Next would be the weapon switching. This one's a little bit tricky to implement because of the way that the controls are currently set up. However, I think the solution would be to put the character switching on L3 while maintaining a majority of the inputs as they currently are, which would leave L2 free to use for weapon switching. Alternatively, they could just make L3 the way that weapon switching works, since we don't have to take projectile-based weapons into account with most of the characters. There is a bit of an issue with that though regarding the arsenal of weapons that is available to the entire cast of characters, not to mention the fact that you can actually acquire duplicates. So in order to address this aspect of the game, I think they should give the ability to set a select amount of weapons as your favorites and only allow you to switch between those favorites. I'd say about 3 to 5 weapons to switch between is pretty reasonable, because I don't think anyone wants to cycle through 20 weapons at once just to get to the ones they wanted to use. There is something else they could try, and that would be to forego the weapon switching in favor of an on-the-fly character switching feature. As of current, the game only allows you to switch out secondary characters whenever you're near a yellow save mirror. An on-the-fly character switching feature would just save you the time of having to go to one of these mirrors if there's some kind of obstacle or alternate path to go through, and I think it would be particularly useful in the later half of the game where you actually need to make use of several characters just to get through a stage. The last quality of life improvement that I would like to see be implemented would be around the magic. Dawn of Dreams pulls all of the magic together, so for example, if I use a magic attack with Soki's weapon, weapon, Lamentation, and then switch over to Excalibur, then whatever magic was left over on Lamentation will be the same on Excalibur. So in my opinion, it would be better if it was like the rest of the games within the series where any magic that I use on one weapon is strictly tied to that one weapon alone. To add to that, I would like to see them color code the magic gauge based on the element of the weapon that you're using, like in past entries. I personally don't think it would be too difficult to do because despite the arsenal of weapons we have, we only have 6 elements featured in the game, those being fire, wind, ice, light, earth, and darkness, which in my opinion should be renamed to lightning. And lastly, as for features, I think Dawn of Dreams would likely receive a similar feature or features as Onimusha 2 did, and likely what Onimusha 3 will receive, such as a save data transfer feature to unlock some additional costumes that weren't originally there. Maybe they could add in the possibility of playing Onimusha 3's Samanosuke along with Jacques and Michelle in a side mode that's new and original for that game, although it's very unlikely that Capcom would do something completely new like that. However, considering the fact that a handful of areas from 3 are in Dawn of Dreams and the fact that the game is on the same engine, maybe that's not entirely impossible. Also, I think the Street Fighter costumes that originally needed to be unlocked via cheat codes should just be available to use from the start of the game in the remaster. There is one last thing that I think they might be able to do with this remaster, and that is to implement an FOV slider. Technically, you can pull back the camera in certain areas of the game as well as in the Dark Realm, but it's very limited to where the camera can be controlled, and it has to be readjusted every time you change cameras or change rooms. That's all I can really think of in terms of new features, so with that, I'd like to know what you'd like to see in terms of changes and improvements in both Onimusha 3 and in Dawn of Dreams. Do you agree with the suggestions that I've made so far for both of these games, or is there something that you feel as though I forgot to mention? Let me know down in the comment section below, and while you're at it, if you like today's video, feel free to give it a like and consider subscribing. I have another Onimusha related video in the works that I think might be of interest to some of you, so stay tuned for that. But until then, I'll see you all in the next one. Matane!